I'm of an age where I remember Bahama Breeze as a flavor of wine cooler. So they said, "What does Bahama Breeze smell like?" And I was like, "You know what it tastes like?" I was like, 18-year-old regret. That's what it is. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. Fragrance is often seen as the invisible art of cosmetics, but it's also a powerful driver of brand identity, consumer connection, and sustainability. In this episode of Demystifying Cosmetics, I sit down with Cassandra Browning, a fragrance strategist and the founder of Fragrances for Good, to explore how scent can be used more intentionally and responsibly in product development. With a career spanning global fragrance houses and brand side innovation roles, Cassandra has worked across the fragrance value chain from creation and trend forecasting to sustainability and go-to-market strategy. She brings a rare ability to bridge the creative and technical aspects of fragrance development with a strong commitment to conscious formulation and transparency. So together today, we will discuss how brands, especially Indian purpose-driven ones, can navigate the complex world of scent strategy. And Cassandra will share a little bit about her experience helping companies build olfactive identities that are both memorable and meaningful. So welcome to the show, Cassandra.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've heard a lot lately that fragrance is having a moment, but you have been in the industry for a lot longer than the moment that fragrance is having right now. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you got started into the industry in general, and then, equally how you became more focused in the area that you are an expert in now, which is really that fragrance strategy and that intersection of scent and sustainability.
Yeah, I think for me, fragrance has always had a moment. So it's just something I've always been passionate about. And I got into the industry after I graduated about 2006. So I went to university for it in the UK. I am American, and I got a degree in aroma and formulation science. I've always been passionate about it. And I worked in the US in New Jersey, and I was at a fragrance house and then at L'Oreal. So it was quite difficult back then to get into the industry because this was a long time ago, and we didn't have social media like we do now. So I really did not have a clue. I was at L'Oreal, and then I moved back to the UK, which is where I'm based now. And that's actually kind of where sustainability really took a bigger part of my interest in regards to fragrance, because I became the EU fragrance head for Ecover and Method, the cleaning brands. And it was a fabulous role because the fragrance was in-house, which is really unusual to have a fragrance expert in a company. So I was able to work with designers, and packaging designers, industrial designers, innovation, brand. So fragrance was really at the beginning of the whole product development process, which is so unusual because usually it's an afterthought for a lot of people. And so the Ecover brand, which is a Belgian brand, they've been doing eco cleaning for about 30 years. So sustainability was the heart of everything they were doing. And so when I started, they were changing their brand strategy. So it was really my job to make sure that the olfactive strategy resembled the brand strategy, and that was working together holistically to really embed sustainability into everything we were doing. So it was a great learning experience.
And I guess the advantage of having somebody in-house like yourself is that ability to have the transparency and the ability to make decisions on sustainability, which we will totally get into a little bit later. But I think we need to take a step back for those listening to really just, kind of the basic foundational concepts of fragrance and how it is incorporated into a product. And so like any product that is, briefed into a CM, let's say, it does start with a brief, right? So a fragrance starts with a fragrance brief. What is a fragrance brief? What makes a good fragrance brief? And what do you feel like often gets overlooked when creating this brief?
Yeah, so since I was in house, I did not create the fragrances. So I had fragrance house partners who we bought the oil from that was delivered to the factory. So a fragrance brief is basically saying exactly what you want to get from the fragrance. I think people mostly just think about how something smells, but it's actually also how it's made, like the ingredients that you use. So it's about having a really strong strategy about what the brand stands for olfactively and what does success look like. And I think that what I really think is often overlooked is context. I think a lot of people think, oh, I want to do an apple fragrance for a dish soap. But if you could provide more context to the fragrance houses about who's your target audience? Oh, it's a 50-year-old woman. Okay, fine. What are you hoping to achieve with the launch? Are you trying to stand out? Are you trying to be close into category norms? Like, how does this launch fit within the brand? Because that can be really helpful for the fragrance houses, because they may say, oh, you're trying to disrupt a 50-year-old woman's dishwashing habits. Maybe you should go with vanilla. Apple's too normal. So it's really about having more information to the fragrance houses and them understanding your brand so you can really get what you want, and using fragrance as a strategic tool as opposed to like an afterthought.
Yeah. And that's interesting you mention it, because I would have never thought about, including a demographic, but it's true, right, that, the notion of smell can change based on life experiences. And I had a very funny example actually yesterday where somebody had brought up something that was called Bahama Breeze as a smell and kind of joking around about that. I'm of an age where I remember Bahama Breeze as a flavor of wine cooler. So they said, what does Bahama Breeze smell like? And I was like, do you know what
Regret.
It tastes like? I was like, 18-year-old regret. That's what it is. So that's very interesting. And, you talked about what it olfactively stands for, I think is that how you framed it? That concept to me is, I have no idea what that means. So, when you talk about how to speak, or I guess align brand with what the brand stands for, and then how to do that from an olfactive perspective, is that, using verbiage to create the fragrance that you think resonates with the brand?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely. So let's use Ivory, right, as an example. Like, Ivory is about caring. It's about looking after yourself, like cocooning kind of. So that translates into a fragrance's naturality, things that you would think in terms of adjectives that are really helpful for a fragrance house. And then you can kind of drill down into ingredients that you would see as being within that frame. Often it's when you're writing like a fragrance, strategy for a brand, it's often about what it's not, as opposed to what it is, because it's hard to say everything that something is. But, like, I'd be surprised if Ivory decided to make a cotton candy fragrance, for example, right? Yeah. So it's kind of about those adjectives, which is very helpful when you're talking to internal stakeholders within a company. And then using those more drilling down ingredients for when you're talking to a fragrance house, but kind of painting that picture, and even providing, pictures for people, like, so that they can really understand, who is this customer, who is this brand, who are we trying to sell fragrance to?
Yeah. And, following up on that, how do you work with clients that, may think they know what they want, but you don't have that language, right? Don't have the adjectives or verbiage to articulate the scent that they want? Yeah,
I think the thing that I notice most is to try and move away from the I like. I think that fragrance is very subjective, which is great, but then part of it is not subjective. So trying to think about, what is your end consumer that you're trying to hit? What is it that they would like? And so if you have a strong brief to the fragrance house, or when you're starting the project, if you're trying to create something that smells premium and caring, and it needs to perform very well in a laundry detergent when you pull it out of the machine, those are very things to kind of refer back to. So I often find that if everyone's agreed on what the brief is, when you kind of smell something, you're like, oh, I don't like this. It's kind of like, well, let's think about, does it smell premium? Does it smell caring? And performance and stability are both things that they're not subjective. It either works or it doesn't work, or it's stable or it's not. So it's trying to even bring in those, if you can't identify what flower it is, that's fine. That's my job, but do you think it smells premium? That's something that most people can talk about and have an opinion about. And asking a lot of questions is what I tend to do, to try and dig into what is it that you're really seeing, instead of it smells like my grandma's house, is not what do you do with that?
The first thing that came to mind, which was, when you said, when you smell something, you're like, I don't like that. It's almost like, dealing with a toddler where you're like, use your words. Why don't you like it?
But fragrance is really hard. Like it's hard to know what it is. And I think laundry is such a complex category. And the fragrances that are created are so technical and creative, but it's so hard, even for me, often to describe a laundry fragrance. So I understand, but you're right. It's a different, but that's why I have a job, so I can describe them, right?
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure, things like air and light, that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucapse line by going to tagra.com/Cellucapse. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
So moving into kind of the meat of the episode in terms of sustainability, introduce me to this concept of sustainable fragrance, what it means in practice, and, kind of where we currently are in an industry and maybe where we're falling short.
Yeah, I think for me, fragrance sustainability is about making thoughtful, purposeful choices into how you incorporate scent. To be honest with you, if you really want to be sustainable, you probably don't completely sustainable. You don't use fragrance, but obviously most people, myself included, prefer fragrance. But when you think about sustainability, it's really hard to tick every box, and sustainability means different things for different people, right? Like it can mean fewer ingredients. It can mean only essential oils. It can mean only synthetic ingredients. It can mean incorporating waste materials. So it's really like there's no set guidelines about what it means. I think from a fragrance house point of view, sustainability is trying to maximize value from a supply chain, right? So trying to reduce waste by coming up with new ways to process oils so that you can get upcycled ingredients, and proactively protecting resources, because with the world heating up, there's many ingredients that are only grown in certain countries, right? So, it's in the fragrance house's best interest. They're a business, like everything, to look after their sources, but also to make sure that, there's fair system for growers, that we're protecting livelihoods, and probably in the future also thinking about the regions that we can start growing these ingredients that we couldn't before. So it's kind of more of a supply chain thing in terms of, I would say, the fragrance houses and really different metrics for brands, really.
When you talk about those metrics, are there any frameworks or tools that you rely on to evaluate a fragrance, either environmental or ethical footprint?
So there's quite a few programs, mostly from retailers or governments, that ban specific ingredients, right? Fragrance ingredients and other ingredients like Target's Clean Beauty or the EPA Safer Choice. But they're only focusing on individual materials and not an entire fragrance. I would say Cradle to Cradle looks at a whole product, but fragrance is such a small percentage of that it's probably not that level of detail. So there's really not an industry-wide standard for fragrance sustainability, because if you think about a fragrance, there's about at least usually 30 ingredients within that. And each ingredient has a supply chain, right? So it's really, really complex, and it has its own sourcing, its own farming, its own processing, its own environmental impact. So it's very, very difficult. And I think some fragrance houses are doing a great job, quite a few now, that are creating internal scorecards, measuring things. So measuring ISO 1612, which is renewability, or ISO 9235, which is naturality, or biodeg, or upcycled. So houses are starting to do this, but things like water use or land impact or carbon footprint are really almost impossible to do right now, unless you're kind of coming up with like a set like number. I mean, and also like, what's the definition of local? There's no set definitions of things. And I think that is really what the challenge is, and the data challenge. And I have done like a sustainability scorecard for some clients, and they had about 3 or 4 fragrance houses that were supplying them, trying to get some fragrance houses to agree when they are competition with each other, to get them to agree on definitions of metrics is almost, it's not impossible, but it's really, really difficult. So I think this is where I would say the future is, and I'm hoping something like AI may help towards that, being able to work on those supply chains. But as a customer, as a someone who's buying a fragrance, you don't want to paint yourself into a corner either, right? Like if, let's say, Florida orange oil, like is what you usually have in your fragrance, and they have a massive, hurricane, and there is no more Florida orange oil. So they give you Brazilian orange oil. But if you have all these sort of metrics in place, they can't replace it for you within your formulation. So you want to be nimble, so it's a really tough one, to be honest.
And how, in interacting with some fragrance houses, I know there is not a lot of transparency because of maybe the proprietary nature of formulas. How difficult is it to even obtain or ascertain compositional breakdowns in a quantifiable way to even make an assessment, right? Is the assessment that you're making just that, like you're sourcing linalool from this X source, even though it may be in the formula at 0.1% and therefore, is far outweighed by, another component like limonene or something. Is that how you have to, at this juncture, make the assessments because of the proprietary nature of fragrance?
Basically, the fragrance houses makes those decisions, right? Because I would say if you're a major client, you do often have access to the formulations, but usually it's quite controlled who does. So it's not like many people can see it. It's usually the head of regulatory. So it's very unusual for anyone to access that. And basically, if you were a client, you probably wouldn't even know that the orange oil had changed. But from their point of view, the fragrance house's point of view, they want to have as much width to be able to have different ingredients to give you and still smell the same. So you're not really getting that level of transparency, to be honest. And I think that I can't really see it happening unless you're kind of just getting these scorecards are usually giving you like a number, like out of 100, so that you're kind of knowing that this fragrance is more sustainable than this fragrance because this scored 70 and that one scored 65. So you're not really getting that level of detail. And to be honest, not that many fragrance people are into that level of detail. I have just had some projects that have gotten into that.
Yeah. And, I recently had on a gentleman that it was, kind of almost democratizing an LCA, right? The life cycle analysis, like having that, the data available to brands so that they can make decisions on, like if we do this, we do this. The first thing that comes to mind is, fragrance is generally a fairly low percentage of the formula.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So, it doesn't, our brands may be hesitant to even walk into this sustainability conversation about fragrance because they're like, well, I can change 7 other ingredients and have a better sustainability profile than this 1% fragrance. Have you observed that?
Definitely, because it is like, if it's like max for most things, like 1%, if even that. I mean, it's such a small part. And I think, when I was working on Ecover, we were the first home product to have an upcycled ingredient. And it was very, very small. But how I saw it is that we were trying to create a demand for upcycled ingredients beyond fine fragrance, because I think these companies are huge, right? Like the fragrance houses. So even if you're having a small change, you're kind of making a massive change in a way, because if there's a demand for something where you're getting more value from it, then you will therefore create, a need for it. And so I think most brands aren't going to have the depth to do this. My hope is that one day we can kind of get into like a rating system, where we can kind of have more understanding about these things. But I think that the fragrance houses are so smart, and they want to look after the ingredients themselves. You know what I mean? Because the world is heating up, and it's just like they're going to do it as well. But I think for most brands, it's probably too deep unless it's a real focus.
Yeah. And when, what are the common misconceptions you hear when you hear brands say that they want something, quote unquote, clean, quote unquote, eco, or quote unquote, non-toxic?
Yeah, I think the fact that people think that there's a clear definition for all these things, and words like clean sounds simple, but it's so complicated. I mean, there's no universal definition. There's no standard. It carries so much weight. I think that what you need to look at is what the consumer is hoping that means, right? It's like it's not harmful for them, that it's not harmful to the planet. That's the intention behind it. But when you think of that, it's like, are your ingredients safe? Are they responsibly sourced? How renewable are you? Like, those are all the even more questions. Is it natural or synthetics? Those are all the things that go behind those words. And I think there's no checklist, right? It's all about trying to balance. And I think eco-friendly is the one that, like, I have had to deal with more than any other. And I think that one, from a consumer perception, has the biggest work to do. And I think most brands are afraid to have the conversation because the end consumer assumes that if something is natural, that is good, and that if it is synthetic or man-made, that it is bad. And to be honest, like, naturals are amazing, but they have more allergens in them. And like, arsenic is natural, right? So just because something is natural does not mean does not mean it's
seeds,
good,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Does not mean that it's good for you. So like, there's pros and cons for both. But I mean, I don't think that people kind of understand that, like, it takes 10,000 pounds of rose petals to make 1 pound of rose oil, right? So if you think of the water, the land, the energy, all that goes into that, it's huge. But I do think it's quite interesting that there's certain, like Nordic Swan in the Nordic countries, Eco Label, they have a strategy of having 100% synthetic ingredients because they think it's nice, better for skin, and that it's better for the environment. And then you have EcoCert, which is 100% essential oils, or ISO 9235. So you have basically people who are trying to achieve the same thing, but completely different ways of going about it. So I think transparency is key to your consumer. But I do think that you want to really make sure that your consumer really cares before you go down that, because natural and synthetics, it's just such a loaded conversation.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, my mind always goes to this like concept of living in the gray space, right? Where you can't, you can be very black and white about it, but I think that is, not a viable place for brands to live if it's, in the absolute, again, like absolute synthetic versus absolute natural.
Yeah. Happy medium.
Exactly. Living in the gray space. And, when you talk about a brief, and let's say, again, like going back to your example of the Florida citrus oil, how do you maybe approach those trade-offs between a sustainable ingredient and maybe one that's central to the brief?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, it's usually like the perfumer's decision, but it's, I think, important that the fragrance house knows your brand DNA, like they know what you value, right? And what your priorities are. I think that if you have something that's central to the brief that you're either going to make claims about, and claims around fragrance should always be discussed at the very beginning of a brief, then that's probably the more non-negotiable. Like if there's something that you want to name it on pack, if you want to name it Elang or something, then those are things that are probably non-negotiable unless you change your mind. And in terms of like making those more sustainable choices, the fragrance houses, the perfumers will make that decision, kind of knowing that your brand really prioritizes them. And that's kind of your job to communicate what the priorities are, because they're the ones who can kind of know the ins and outs of what's more sustainable and what's not,
Moving on to a little bit more on like, kind of the development of fragrance. Where do your creative ideas come from? Like what inspires your thinking when you're building a fragrance concept?
Yeah, for me, it comes from everywhere. You know, it could be like walking down the street and smelling someone, which sounds creepier than it is. Or it could be walking in the woods. It could be just being outside. I think food and food trends are very interesting. Like even booze, like all drink, food and drink, really inspiring. And I think fine fragrance and fashion. I think it's really important to know where your product is in terms of like the trickle down. You know what I mean? Like, is it a trendsetter? Is it like not copycat? No one wants to be a copycat, but is it kind of like after a trend has become more entrenched and people know it? And then really taking those different ingredients or concepts and then twisting them to build new concepts that would work for a brand.
Yeah. And how do culture and category trends play into that strategy? Do you see differences, based on geographic location, as well as, I think you mentioned, demographics like age?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, definitely different countries, different regions have definitely different preferences. You know, I mean, like in like South America, someone told me one time, like coconut and banana and stuff like that is not like, that's their apples. You know what I mean? Like they don't want to, it's not like exciting for them. So I think what's also very interesting with like TikTok and Instagram and stuff is that things that were sort of smaller trends now have become massive. If you look at like the Middle East, like oud and amber and all, and like a really appreciation for really, really strong, fine fragrance is now global. And I think before these things wouldn't become as global, but now that that's global, that will trickle down to other products besides fine fragrance. So it's really interesting to see how things are becoming much more global than they used to be.
Yeah. You touched upon it a little bit, but in thinking about brands that maybe have like products across different categories. So let's say they have a skincare line, but they also have, household products as well as, laundry. How do you start to think about holistically creating and approaching fragrance across different categories while still maintaining a brand identity?
Yeah, I think that is all about having like a fragrance strategy. And that's really about drilling down into like, what does your fragrance stand for? Like, and as I said, it could be describing what you aren't as opposed to what you are. Like when I was working on Ecover, for example, it was fragrances that would be found in nature, right? So that would be working with brand to come up with kind of with this idea. And then sort of that ladders down to like everything where you're showing up, like smelling natural, smelling like something that you could find across different environments outside, but making sure that when you are, but also besides like the notes, it's like the performance, like not every brand wants to be, super strong, like Tide, or, like some things want to be a bit milder. So it's also understanding that and making sure that it's the same across different categories and making sure that it's hitting all the category norms for each one. And I think some brands have specific notes that their consumers love, and they can be the same notes, often kind of a heart that goes across different fragrances, while some they want to go more out there,
Something that comes to mind is, how do you think about innovating in spaces that, have been largely established or dictated by behavior? So a good one I think of is toothpaste, right? So I worked on toothpaste once and I really was, all jazzed up about, well, we could do all these fun flavors that, aren't in the market right now. And the reality was that consumers related mint with cleanliness, right? So they needed that mint to feel as if they had brushed their teeth. And so that really limited a lot of, it was kind of like, well, no one's going to adopt these. So when you have those kind of, and I think maybe laundry care is a good one. I'm starting to see more and more some newer notes of these like scent boosters you can add, but largely, right, there is this need or this desire for clean scents.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. So when you are approached with a project in those kind of industries, how do you start to think about like, okay, well, what is something that, maybe we can push or maybe we can do while still, providing that comfort that the consumer is seeking in terms of like, well, it needs to be clean, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Clean's like a non-negotiable, isn't it? I think there's lots of things that as you were saying, you can do from like either like a technical point of view. Like, do you want to have a ingredient story? Do you want it to have like where you know the whole, and that kind of, a lot of fragrance is also like the story around it. Like, and that's what I'm always quite interested in, is it's like, if you want to talk about clean, do you want to go do a headspace technology where you've gone to like, I don't know, a lemon and Amalfi and taking the headspace of how that actually smells there? Or do you want to do like, we are going to tell a story about the lemon and the people growing it in Amalfi? Or, you know, like, do you want to have a certain kind of lemon? Like, so there's lots of different things that you can, like, is it a Meyer lemon? You know, like all these kind of things. And also the thing with clean is you can get that through so many different notes on the top notes and not just as the entire fragrance. Because to be honest, most of those fragrances have to have those key signals anyways. But it is difficult. I find like in the UK, hand wash is quite a difficult category because it's very hard to stand out, because everything, there's like so many different things that you can't really surprise people with like a weird ingredient anymore, right? Because everyone's like, we've seen it all. This isn't much. But I think a lot of that is making sure that, as we've been talking about the whole time, is that holistically it all makes sense. And the brand storytelling has to support it, because if it doesn't, then the fragrance story won't fly either, you know?
This might be going back to sustainability a little bit, but and it was just something that like came up. But when we think about, like you had mentioned, Meyer's lemon or the lemon in Amalfi, when I think of like food, for like instance tilapia, right? I've read, I haven't noted it myself, but that the flavor of tilapia has changed because we've gone into farm raised tilapia, majority, almost all tilapia, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about fragrance, have you observed that as well, especially when it comes to things like global warming, that, we are now, predominantly reliant on a Meyer lemon that has a very, uniform, distinct smell, taste, that it no longer maybe smells like that original Meyer lemon that was maybe 40 years ago, 50 years ago?
Yeah, I personally haven't noticed too much. I think that it's kind of like what they've spoken about before with like, there's so many different kinds of corns you can grow, right? But then we only really go after one, like you're saying. So I think that there are fewer options of ingredients, right? And investing in those ingredients and kind of doubling down on what does grow well, because it is the supply chain of trying to make sure. But I think that there is, with this upcycling and people wanting new and different things, I think that there are maybe not necessarily the large houses, but there is definitely space for people to go and find more niche ingredients, because I think that's what the consumer is interested in, is having something sort of unique and different that not everyone else can have. But I think before, when you're thinking of like big agriculture and big growers, they're just going after like lavender, lavandin, like, so it's interesting to see. And I think that there are more opportunities now for smaller players to kind of get in there and do that.
Yeah. And do you think that drives consumer desire? So we recently did a survey for, new scents we were potentially launching, and lavender won, which I was kind of like, it seems basic. But then I wonder if, because it's just so widely available, that's the default, right? That's the consumer. So is there kind of that opposing, I guess, consumer behavior that you've noticed, where it's like the new, what's new versus here's the comfort, here's the lavender that I smelled on my mom, that I also want in my dish soap, that I also want in my, how much is there these, kind of opposing dynamics in consumer behavior?
Yeah, I think it's like who you're trying to appeal to, what age bracket. But I think the things that are popular for a reason, right? Like they're beloved, and I think based on the times we're living in, it's nice to have comfort. But it's like if your brand it's trying to achieve that comfort, then that's great. You know what I mean? You're like, okay, cool, don't rock the boat. But if you're trying to get like, I don't know, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whatever, then you're going to try and have to like probably do a vanilla or whatever, So I think there's nothing wrong with kind of like, if something's still popular, but a lot of people, they've already launched the main popular one that most people like, and they're often trying to launch, an ancillary product to get the rest of the people.
So for closing thoughts, what excites you most about the future of the fragrance industry?
I would have to say, we sort of touched about it. I think that when we used to launch products like 15 years ago or whatever, you would just put it out there and you wouldn't really know how it was doing until like you heard either that, it's being discontinued or they're going to keep making it. And I think now with, social media, there's so much more access to consumers and them to us to understand their reactions to things. And when you launch something, like there's so much more comments, there's interaction, which is really great. And I think it does lead some brands to become a bit too trying to chase them as opposed to having like, you need to stand for something. You know what I mean? I think it's really great to understand what everyone's interested in. But as we said, everyone's got an opinion. But to kind of get that insight to their creativity is really fabulous. As long as it doesn't, they shouldn't be driving your product all the time. But I do think also AI is amazing, and like there's so much going on and like reviving lost fragrances and all that stuff. But I mean, I think being able to measure supply chains and all that kind of like not as exciting stuff, but streamlining and traceability, like that's what I'm like really hoping for, that will become like more standardized.
Yeah. And what advice, would you give indie brands that are trying to navigate scent and developing sustainable fragrances creatively and, finding that transparency and traceability?
Hire me. No, I would say
this is where we flash your email in the website.
I would say having a really clear brand strategy is key, because it all trickles down from that. And then bring fragrance into the process early, like to make sure how does it all work, and really finding good suppliers that you want to be with from a fragrance house perspective long term, and thinking of them as your partners. It can be very hard though, people starting out, to find fragrance suppliers because when it's a bit of a gamble for people. But like I think that those partnerships are really valuable, and they can, and helping to think about how fragrance can add to your product and bringing it in early into the process instead of as like an afterthought, because it can add so much to what you're trying to do.
Wonderful. Well, wonderful advice. And again, if anyone is interested in Cassandra's services, she is the founder of Fragrances for Good, and again is in the UK, but
I work globally, so
works globally. There you go. Well, thank you so much for today's conversation.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.